This is a production of Cornell University.
Leading to our roundtable discussion, now I would like to present three speakers, all from Cornell University, to continue our exploration of different perspectives in scholarly communication, especially pertaining to crisis. The first speaker is my colleague Peter Potter from Cornell University Press, editor-in-chief. He has been in scholarly publishing for over 20 years. A historian by training, he received his MA from the University of Virginia. He came to Cornell in 2006 after 17 years at Penn State University Press. At Penn State, he built the press's publications program in history and the social sciences and played a leading role in developing a digital publishing program in collaboration with the university libraries. His collaborative spirit has been instrumental in fostering a number of digital publishing initiatives at Cornell in collaboration with academic units and the library.
Okay, I'd like to make just a few points in response to these papers. From my perspective, inside a university press, struggling to find its place in a changing world of scholarly publishing. Since historically at Cornell, our bread and butter has been the monograph, I have the most to say about Joe's paper, but thinking about the future, I also have a few thoughts as well about what Don had to say. So first, it's instructive to see the degree to which the word crisis has been a part of the vocabulary around university presses since at least the 1950s. I agree that the word is probably overused and exaggerates the degree to which our current situation is really new or unique. On the other hand, I think there is one important difference that distinguishes our current situation. For the first time, print has become, at least potentially, expendable. In all of the previous reports Joe refers to, there's a basic assumption that one way or the other, print publication is the end result of the scholarly publishing process. But now that libraries are no longer the reliable purchasers of monographs they once were, the whole system really is shifting, or as Joe might say, being destabilized in a way we haven't seen before. Libraries, in fact, propped up the system of scholarly publishing for years, and without them, we are forced to rely increasingly on other sources of buyers, primarily individuals. But as Joe shows in his paper, even in the best of days, when libraries were buying lots of books, university presses were not self-supporting. They needed title subsidies as well as general operating support from their universities. In our current situation, though, the numbers are dire. Print runs of 700 to 800 are common, and often that's too high for the demand. Many booksellers sell fewer than 500 copies, and the libraries account for 200, maybe even fewer, of those sales. In such a situation, it's no wonder we're talking about electronic publication. All of that effort and attention poured into books that end up selling only 300 copies is hard to justify. In such a climate, ebooks make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, though, there's still no business model for ebooks. Gutenberg E was a great idea. It was a serious attempt to shift academic book publishing to the electronic environment, but it proved impossible to sustain. As recorded actually in the 2007 Mellon report, a major issue, it said, is that the Gutenberg e-books have all been overlooked in the review pages of the relevant general and specialized journals. The absence of reviews for distinguished prize-winning books is a critical problem, not only for the scholars themselves, but also for the scholarship generally. It is indicative of the transitional state of monograph publishing that review editors who responded to a survey by one of the Gutenberg e-authors were almost unanimous in their request for a printed version of the e-books to distribute for review. In short, although university press publishing has always been a challenge, I do think there's something unique and particular to the current problems we face. Whether we call it a crisis or not, I don't believe that most presses can continue along the same path and expect to survive. The second point I'd like to make is that despite everything I've just said, in many ways the day-to-day life of the majority of university press publishers these days really hasn't changed all that much. We're still caught up in the mundane world of publishing books. Publishers are still competing with each other for narrow monographs, many of them first books by junior professors. And there's no shortage of scholars, young and old, producing new book-length monographs. They may have a notion that not as many of these books are getting published. They may know that there are fewer presses vying for their books than in the past, and they certainly know that publishers are charging more for their books. Some may even have been turned down by a publisher because their book is too narrow or there's not a large enough market. Still, most, I suspect, think they can find a publisher, even if they have to work a little harder, and many will end up finding a publisher. Meanwhile, within university presses, we're doing everything we can to keep the system going. It is harder and harder to reach our overall sales goals. With declining sales per title, we have to publish more books to generate as much income as we did just a few years ago. Editors spend more and more of their time securing subsidies. Not a bad thing in principle, but we're chasing after $500 here, $1,000 there, from departments, scholarly organizations, and foundations. Interestingly, what Joe says, I was surprised by how much this has actually been a part of university press publishing for a lot longer than I had thought. I thought that was something that was more recent, but it's something we faced many, many times before. Consequently, there's much more of a focus on cutting costs in the editorial production process. Standard designs, less intensive editing, no proofreading, eliminating paper and mailing costs through the manuscript and proof stages. More and more POD, print on demand that is, searching the backlist for books to bring back into print, reprinting books as POD rather than offset. In fact, one of the underappreciated effects of the new technologies is not that we've done away with a printed book, but actually that we've made the book more affordable to print. There are some efforts at e-publishing as well within university presses. Mostly at this point, we're experimenting around the edges, participating in such ventures as eBrary, NetLibrary, Kindle, and Don has mentioned a few more ambitious projects at a few presses, but these are supported by external funding, and they're not something that within the press we can support on our own. In fact, there's just not a lot of sustained e-publishing efforts being generated within presses. Okay, so where do we go from here? Cooperation among presses may be one solution, but it's a little hard to see how this will work. The Mellon Foundation should be congratulated on supporting collaboration among presses, publishing first books in specific subject areas. They've recently announced programs in Slavic studies, American literature, South Asian studies, and ethnomusicology. This is certainly encouraging, and I hope it works. I'm not sure, though, that it's sustainable, in which case I'm not sure where it gets us. Gutenberg E was a great idea, but as I just noted, it was financially and practically unsustainable. One option is to pursue more streamlined electronic monograph publishing projects, such as those at California, at Penn State, and now here at Cornell, which Peter Hohendahl will mention, Zignala. If the monograph is here to stay, which at least for the near term seems to be the case, we need to find ways to make electronic publication viable, building on the kind of subscription model that libraries and publishers use for journals, but with print on demand as a ready and immediate option for individual buyers. Beyond this, though, university presses have to come to terms with their place in an evolving world. Peter Brantley, among others, say that UPs need to go local, tie ourselves to our local communities and regions, or become more of an essential player within our parent institutions. I think this is right. Some presses may find that going local in one's region will work. A press like UNC or New Mexico, for instance, seem like obvious possibilities for that. Others, I think, must do this by pursuing partnerships inside their institutions. Joe is right, unfortunately, about presses increasing estrangement from the universities that called them into being. But I love what Joe says about presses and their parent universities capitalizing on the ties and obligations we have to one another. We need to become part of a larger effort to coordinate all publishing operations within our universities, the move toward what the Ithaca Report calls university publishing. This will inevitably involve expanding into areas outside of the humanities where we may not have traditional strengths. Cornell, that might mean the sciences, business school, the hotel school even. It also means more collaboration with our libraries and more collaboration with our own faculties. And here is where I see the most promise for the kind of publishing opportunities Don describes out of archives, special collections, and scholarly editions here at Cornell. And we certainly have precedents to build on here at Cornell with the success of the Cornell Wordsworth and the Cornell Yeats. And perhaps ironically, this would take us back to our traditional roots as university presses, not as service units, but as integral parts of the academic enterprise. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce Peter Hovendahl, Jacob Gold Sherman Professor of German and Comparative Literature. Peter joined the faculty of Cornell in 1977 and has held a number of positions, including the directorship of the Institute for German Cultural Studies and chairing the Department of German Studies. He has an extensive editorial board experience, including being SNEER editor or board member. And I would also like to note his recent role as the series editor of a digital monographic series called Signali, Modern German Letters, Cultures, and Thought. He has published numerous monographs and articles in the areas of literary criticism, cultural history, and intellectual history. And more recently, he published several essays on the present state of the humanities and the future of American universities. Peter.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will approach the question of academic publishing from the perspective of the scholar in a specific discipline within the humanities, namely the perspective of German studies, a field that has been faced with a number of problems in the area of publishing, most of them related to the size of the discipline in comparison with other fields. What I have to say can also be applied, however, to a number of other fields that find themselves in similar circumstances. I would think of Italian, French, Russian, possibly Japanese and Chinese. My remarks will touch on 4 points. First, I will look at the present situation of the discipline in terms of access to publishing. My second point will address the consequences of this situation for the development of research within the discipline, especially the question of rewards and penalties. My third point will touch on new developments in the arena of academic publishing. And finally, I want to examine financial models that could clarify the present uncertainty in academic publishing by looking at the German situation in comparison with the American system. I hope to come up with some tentative suggestions. Now, the first point. There is no doubt that the term crisis has been overused in recent debates about academic publishing. Actually, there were no golden years. As Joe has told us, the problems have simply changed. But they can be real and challenging for a particular discipline that all of a sudden finds itself at the margins of academic publishing. This happened to the field of German in this country in the early years of this decade, when a number of important series were closed within a very few years. This happened to the series at Nebraska, then to the series at Wayne State, and finally to a series at North Carolina that had just been launched. In each case, it was a business decision by the press which decided that the series was not commercially viable, i.e., it did not produce enough income. This is important to note that the series at Nebraska and Wayne State were very successful in terms of national visibility and academic recognition. In the case of Nebraska, which I know best because I was the editor, the press could not argue that we lost money, but the director emphasized that he wanted to focus on those parts of its program where the press actually made money. Behind this decision stood the more fundamental decision of the parent institution, the University of Nebraska, not to give subventions to the press anymore. A university press that has to be on its own will necessarily focus on areas that are profitable. Under these circumstances, smaller disciplines where the sales will necessarily be limited are clearly in jeopardy. The second point, the decision of university presses either to close a series or to leave an academic field that they once covered has long-term consequences for that discipline. First of all, they limit opportunities for publishing in a specialized field. It becomes simply more difficult to find a publisher for one's manuscript, and this is particularly true for younger scholars. But there is more involved. The impoverished conditions impact scholarship also in terms of available topics and approaches. Especially young scholars have to make sure that they do not work in an area that will not pass through the filters of academic presses. In the case of German studies, this process had hurt especially single-author scholarship and research on the Renaissance, the Baroque, and the Enlightenment, because the readership in these fields is relatively small. Frequently, sales will not cover the cost. As a consequence, these subfields of German studies have been relatively neglected during the last 2 decades. The rewards went to research in the 20th century with an emphasis on interdisciplinarity. My third point addresses present efforts to stem the tide, that is to say, to find new publishing outlets for scholars in German studies. The realization that recent developments in academic publishing in the US had a serious negative impact on the intellectual profile of the discipline led to a number of initiatives to restore publishing opportunities in areas that are not supported by current trends. I will focus my remark on recent efforts at Cornell to set up a new series in German studies that would include works from a number of disciplines, among them German literature, philosophy, history, art history, and cultural history. The new venture got off the ground because the Cornell group, consisting of faculty members from a number of departments, a representative of Cornell University Press, Peter Potter, and a representative of the library, Kaiser Walker, realized that we had to come up with a new model, a model that would solve the financial problems of the series that had failed. We needed, in other words, a new business model, and we needed a new technology. These two things really went together. The key element was and is the collaboration between the library and the press, the purpose of which is to bring down and control cost. The most important initial decision was to shift from traditional to electronic publishing. I believe that electronic publishing will be the future of academic publishing. I say that with a heavy heart because I'm personally a lover of the book. But I realize that many colleagues do not agree with this assessment. It is worth noting that the new technology is coming from the library rather than the press. Right now, the new series called Signale is beyond the planning stages, and it is actually looking at manuscripts. We hope that the first books will be out in 2009. My final point addresses the financial aspect. By this I mean not only the new series at Cornell, but also the larger issue of financing academic publishing. In the case of Signale, we hope to make the venture financially viable by controlling production costs. Yet we are not sure whether this will be the answer. If our premise is that the scholarly value of a book cannot be determined in terms of its commercial success, then academic publishing has to find a solution for those books that will not be profitable because of a limited readership. The American system has traditionally shifted these costs either to the press or to a third party, for instance, a foundation or a sponsor. By and large, the author has not been asked to contribute, at least not in the last 30 years or so. By comparison, the German system has typically expected a contribution from the author in whose career interest it is to get the book published. The reason is the lack of university presses. Academic presses in Germany are privately owned and in most cases too small to offset the cost by a mixed calculation that takes the profits from other areas to support scholarly publications. Until recently, foundations have assisted young scholars with their first and second book to launch their careers. Lately, however, foundations have more or less withdrawn their support, thereby shifting the burden back to the author. In some instances, the university have created funds to cover the cost of outstanding works, but this is not a systematic attempt and certainly no solution within the German system. Should we consider the German model, which, as I found out, is actually also an older American model? What would it mean not only for the author but also for the university presses and the parent institutions, the university? Or would it be better to look at the resources of the American university as a viable funding source? After all, it is common that universities spend large amounts of money to set up young scholars in physics and chemistry. This cost is completely taken for granted and never discussed. By comparison, the cost of publishing the first book of a humanist would be very small indeed. Yet it seems that American research universities have not yet embraced this model, possibly still hoping that foundations will pick up the tab. Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce our last speaker before we open it for discussion among our group. Naoki Sakai is a professor in the departments of Asian Studies, Comparative Literature, and History, which really demonstrates his diversity of his scholarship. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago, Department of Far Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He has published in the fields of comparative literature, comparative intellectual history, translation studies, the studies of racism and nationalism, and the histories of semiotic and literary multitude. He has led the highly praised and influential project of Traces, a multilingual series in 4 languages, Korean, Chinese, English, and Japanese, and served as its founding senior editor. Naoki.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can offer sort of an adequate response to the Joe's and Dan's very insightful analysis of the situation. I'd like to do it in an international context. And in the 1990s, I have been involved in a project of international publishing rather unwittingly. In many respects than one, I was sort of encountering what is meant by the crisis of publishing, not necessarily in the United States. Together with my friends, I have been working to publish a multilingual series called Traces, and initially in 4 languages, English, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. We just a month ago decided that we are going to expand these languages to include German, Italian, and Spanish. So it will be published in 7 languages. In this process, I came to realize that in most industrial societies today, publishing is one of the industries most thoroughly subjected to the inner premises of the nation state. Unlike other industrial products, books are to be sold within the market of national language. And furthermore, national languages are supposed to inhabit each of the geographically enclosed territories of nation states. Most publishers therefore believe that they should promote their products only within the market of their own national language. They know that small number of their products are also purchased outside their national market, but usually the number is negligible from their marketing perspective. Therefore, it is difficult for them not to conceive of their market in terms of inside and outside of the national language. Often, the development of national language publishing market has been essential in the project of nation building. Therefore, immediately after the Second World War, countries like Taiwan and Korea poured a huge amount of resources into publishing to create the national readership. And of course, that Japan did it, and France and other European countries did it in, in 19th century. Yet what I have observed was a rapid transformation of academic publishing, particularly in East Asia and Western Europe. And traditionally, there have been some exceptions to this nationalist presumption prevalent in the publishing world. Many countries that I have visited have been old empires. Those national languages were also used in their colonies. French and Japanese are such cases. And then, for instance, in 1920s and 30s, Japanese language, for instance, was used sort of widely in East Asia. But today, the most important exception would be the English language. Without doubt, to a great extent, our project of traces became possible thanks to the global use of English language. Increasingly, English is used outside territories of English-speaking countries, Britain, United States, Australia, and so forth. Not surprisingly, what is often referred to as the English language imperialism is the first major problem that Project of Traces had to confront. In the 1990s, a growing sense of crisis could be found in many academia across the globe. It is not only the number of American PhDs who acquired high positions at government offices and large corporations in countries like Taiwan, South Korea, China, and so forth, but also that in the non-too-distant future, already at that time, more than 10 years ago, many important academic positions would be occupied by the returnees from the graduate schools at American universities. So therefore, there was a very, very strong nationalist reaction to the foreseeable future, and then there's a very strong tension between those who rather welcome the English language publication and education on the one hand, and those who insisted on the national language education in many countries in the world. Furthermore, today, that projection of 10 years ago is readily confirmed. Furthermore, one can observe a new trend away from the nationalist premises of academia. In the last few years, an increasing number of universities in East Asia and in, as you know, Europe as well, have begun to offer courses in English, and fluency in English language has already been established as a universal marker of social class mobility. The The use of English language in what they perceived to be globalization played a decisive role symbolically as well as institutionally. In due course, this sense of crisis prompted a widespread refusal and denunciation of English language in many parts of the world during the 1990s. While the use of English was regarded as the most distinct symbol of one's cultural capital, it gave rise to a nationalist defense. In the name of defense of national or ethnic language, it was denounced as a very, very direct exercise of imperialist imposition. I cannot I cannot deny that there is certain truth in this assessment of global capitalism, but too often the use of English language was judged in terms of, rather I would say, misleading disjunctives, international or national, global or local or universal or particular. Moreover, the nationalist denunciation of the English language imperialism promoted, strangely enough, promoted rather than a hindrance to the global domination of English language, since it would only encourage those individuals refusing to speak English to retreat back into the national and ethnic language. The project of Trace was born as a consequence of a collaboration among intellectuals who were concerned with global domination of English language on the one hand, and emergence of nationalist exclusionism on the other. Our solution to this dilemma was actually the idea of translation. We wanted to create a social space which is opened up through translation. From this perspective, I'd like to mention two issues that are perhaps relevant to the topic discussed in this panel. The first one is the problem of modern intellectual history. I think Dan already touched upon it, particularly in the countries and societies of the so-called non-West. What constitutes modernity in intellectual history in the non-West is the fact that invariably question of thought has been posed primarily as one of translation. Since the 18th century, an increasing number of intellectuals have encountered the problem of modernity as they were exposed to the dominant forces of the West. For them, modernity began as they were forced to translate within a particular regime, mainly translate so-called European texts and books. But it is equally important to stress that the West is far from being a trans-historical tradition. It was created by the very distinction that the West and the non-West was drawn. Therefore, it is very interesting. It is, in fact, the West was created in the process in which the non-Western intellectuals were engaged in reading of the Western text and translating them. The second one is an extension of the first. It is concerned that the project being organized by this is the kind of project currently being organized by my colleague Brett Duberry, involving Tokyo University and Leipzig University, and a number of similar associated projects such as International Encyclopedia of Intellectual Historians, and then also development of search engine for the humanists. And this project will be conducted in 3 languages, English, German, and Japanese, will be linked to the project of Traces. It is an attempt to reorganize archive hitherto prearranged according to the disciplinary rules of national history. Interesting enough, such a project is now possible thanks to the availability of digital technology and English language. But as I think Dan already pointed out, it is not merely the question of digital editing. We have to go beyond this, and therefore we have to organize a number of strategies according to which we will start re-articulating the disciplinary rules based upon which humanities has been built. And then we are thinking about developing a certain number of strategies to that effect. This should imply, in fact, the use of the English language does not necessarily lead to the elimination of heterogeneity. In fact, through the reconceptualization of translation and deployment of transnational tactics, we can actually take advantage of global use of the English language in order to create and sustain an intellectual community of translation and call into question the very distinction between the West and the non-West that it has been reproduced many, many times in the humanities. Finally, let me point out a very interesting development in East Asia, and I think it's occurring in other areas like Latin America and Europe as well. 20 years ago, intellectuals did not interact across national borders among China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. In fact, they remained so ignorant of each other, precisely because of Cold War structure. In order to talk with the intellectuals of other East Asian countries, they had to come to the United States. They could communicate only through their bilateral channels with United American Academy. Today, intellectual exchange is proliferating rapidly among these countries. It's an amazing number of projects are going on already, not necessarily involving United States, but between China, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, and so forth. And then publishing is proliferating too. But interestingly enough, what made it possible to have that kind of communication is huge number of East Asian intellectuals speak English. This kind of communication is not facilitated by neither Chinese language or Japanese or Korean, but it's English. They no longer need to rely upon bilateral channels with the United States. In their own context, many multilateral channels are now available. Of course, we can think of a number of reasons for this historic transformation, but there is one condition that we definitely cannot overlook today. It is the use of English language among Asian intellectuals. And in fact, it does not necessarily lead to the oppression of local languages. Rather, in fact, we can invent a different configuration of the global and local. And then probably in this respect, it is very interesting to see how the academic publishing itself is transforming today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
I guess a couple of observations or questions. Just to go back to the English language. Yeah. I think I agree with everything you said, but I'd like to add a minor digital detail. Is that indeed within the academic communities, I would imagine in China, in Japan, I'm not as familiar with them, familiar with other parts of the world, say the Middle East, where English has a peculiar complex status for obvious reasons. There is another version of the English that is not tied neither to the university nor to business, and it's tied to digital technology itself. People learn English because they learn HTML, and because in order to program minimally, they have to know English, because all programming languages are in effect based on some variation of English. And that English is very interesting because it's creating a new environment that is actually driving social networks outside the dominant English or Western European thing. And I think it's interesting to compare what happens between the global and the locals in that kind of sort of situation, where the digital sort of infrastructure has an immediate impact. And this brings me to sort of a question, kind of a response to the earlier presentation, that is, it seems to me perhaps it's interesting, I don't know, but that's my own prejudice, to distinguish between academic and scholarly publishing. And that is to take the French as a model, where it's traditionally been scholarly rather than academic. And there's been a very clear established long history of it, where very influential intellectuals were not academics, but were published as scholars and had a very important role to play. Not to minimize the academic dimension, but also to bring out some issues that are purely institutional, that seem to shape the, shall we say, the method, as well as the content and approaches that deal with it. And that complicates the scene, because obviously in Germany it's different. In the UK we have a combination between, shall we say, to simplify the French and the American model, where the university presses are taken. And if that is the case, I think we have perhaps more, I don't know if it's more interesting, but more complex things as well to do. But it seems to be perhaps interesting to kind of throw this out and see what are kind of the direct, because after all, what IDEA is extremely institutionally driven and based. And what's interesting about the digital world is that most of it developed outside of the institution. If we think at the uses that happened, was that despite the infrastructure was developed within universities, it really happened outside. And we're trying to deal with its impact on our world. But it's just...
Me? Okay, just a couple of comments. Thinking about the melon and what the melon can do, one of my concerns has been how to get people to think. It's so hard to think. And I'm very interested in editions, but the crisis in the humanities is caused by kind of an inability to move forward, which is caused by lots of problems. But I think the trick for me has always been, I always think of my job as trying to build mousetraps to catch, to make people work. So sometimes I can develop reference works that will, or some commission people to do books, and this will somehow force people. This is how I work. I never start to write anything until the due date, and I just know the psychology of trying to get things to come out is important. In the last 30 years in America, there's been an increasing sense of control, which has made the people who are the most talented very reluctant to speak. And so I think that addressing the problem at the present moment means thinking about that sort of issue. On the question, I think the question of peer review, which came up a couple times yesterday, is really one of the very few issues which really crosses national boundaries. And as I said yesterday, it has surprised me, and there are reasons. I was talking to Milad about this earlier today. The other countries that are interested in peer review are interested in them for different reasons than the Americans are. And they don't have the traditions of trial by jury, which is an essential sort of social, it's a sort of Anglo-American, sometimes I've come to think it's an quaint Anglo-American custom. But it's interesting to other people who are trying to break down the old boy network and trying to find ways of getting innovation in their countries. And they're also trying to deal with the same sort of situation that led to the developments of the peer review system, which is a vast increase in education systems. So the educational systems in China and in Brazil could increase, and the social discontent could become much greater if there's more sort of oppression from the old boys. So somehow, either the simulacrum of openness has to be created, or else actual openness has to happen. Now, I always believe that somewhere in Beijing there's some really smart people in the government who understand that if China is to become very strong, it is going to have an innovative educational system. And I know that there are fights between the people in China about these sort of issues. I'm actually an editor of a series at Yilan Press in Nanjing with Wang Hui, which is supposed to do something like what we did at Minnesota with the theory and history of literature. It's strange, but there's that strong interest in these. This is just a backup Naoki Sakai's view. These things have they've really transformed themselves vastly in the last number of years. And since I first went to Nanjing in '96, people are not thinking. Some people are not thinking in terms of national boundaries. Now, if you bomb my embassy in Belgrade, think about that again.
Actually, before getting another question, I want to turn over to the panel to see if they have any comments for Milad or Lindsay. Or should we continue to get more comments?
Well, I appreciated your point about the academic and scholarly distinction. As I was preparing my remarks, it sort of jumped out at me how many of these projects that we're funding really have a contributory basis to them. rather than a kind of institutional base. And that distinction was surprising to me. I hadn't quite appreciated it. And I think that sort of gets at the point you made and a point that was made a couple of times yesterday about the need to engage broader audiences, not just in the institutions. And to the extent that presses, I think we've been hearing that the need to sort of engage those broader audiences is part of a publishing enterprise. I think your point's very well taken. And
Go ahead, please. Can I follow up on that just a tiny bit? Maybe I could suggest that we might add one more component to the mix. We've basically been talking about those who do the publishing and those who do the producing of the object that's published. But of course, none of that makes any sense without readers. And obviously, most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, those readers are people who are also eventually going to be producing something themselves to be published. That's the point of making it scholarly. But in fact, that's a very narrow way to look at it. And if you think in terms of who is the person working with the material once it is produced, then you have to ask the question of access, which was implicitly implied both, in several of the responses, but also in both what Lindsay and Milad said. And the problem with scholarly publishing is that it's partly dependent on what I would call anti-publishing, blocking access, not always enabling access. Let me give you an example. My first book, a scholarly monograph, which received indeed a subsidy from the ACLS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it didn't cost the university anything to produce it, University Press anything to produce it. I have a friend in the UK who wanted to use that book for his graduate seminar. He called the press and said, I'd like 26 copies of the book. They said it's out of print. I said, well, then great. Can I have it back? I'll give it a Creative Commons license, stick it on the web, make it accessible. They said, no, it'll never be out of print because we can always do print on demand for $200 a copy. In other words, they have blocked access to scholarly communication. They are not enabling it. That's one example. The other example is the one implied, in effect, indirectly also by what Milad said, which is if you're not a member of a university or an equivalent institution, you can't get access to the libraries and to the digital archives. I work a lot with Artful, with the people in Chicago, in order to work on that ongoing research environment. But if you are an individual scholar or a member of the public, or in some cases, one of my students, and you don't have access to a university environment, which has paid the extremely high subscription to get access to the electronic encyclopedia, you cannot participate in that research environment of production, exchange, and reading. Well, we can say you've got to cover your costs. Yes, but guys, we've already been scooped by Google Books. You know, that horse is not only out of the barn, it's off the range. That we've got to have some kind of equivalent where we manage to work with these access problems in a way that is going to recognize how readership and not publishing practices have already changed.
Wonderful. Any comments from you?
I would briefly like to respond to that. I think one of the experiments that we are working with at Signale is, of course, we will have print on demand, and I think this is very important for the professional side. A young scholar who doesn't have a book in her hand when she comes up for tenure will be disadvantaged. So that's really important. But the main thing would be that the work is also electronically available. And we are just experimenting with that and don't have a firm model. But in my opinion, it's extremely important that the work is accessible, not only here at Cornell or at other major libraries, but globally. That is the difference between former forms of publishing and what should happen now.
And I'd like to add that I think my strong belief within university press publishing is that our goal is one of our main goals is not just simply to make books accessible, but to make them affordable. And the idea of doing POD backlist books, we make a very deliberate attempt to keep the price down. So I can't think of a POD book on our list that's over $30. So that's something that's part of what we see as our mission. And once we recovered the investment, the upfront investment, we do try to make books affordable, and POD is making that increasingly possible.
Yes, the panel has addressed the crisis with the issues of publishing, and has mentioned several actors who were involved in foundations, universities, university presses, libraries. And being from Latin America and knowing tradition in Europe, it seems very strange that one actor hasn't been mentioned, which is the state. And in France, in many places, the state plays a crucial role, be it through libraries or special archives, in the dissemination of knowledge and scholarly works. So I was wondering if, in the different ways,
the NEH did come up in my remarks. What? The NEH, which would be the relevant arm of the state for these purposes, did come up in my remarks.
Yes, but is there a broader role that you see in this crisis of publishing for the state and to address any of the different types of problems that were mentioned?
We just escalate, if we address that question, we escalate the types of crisis we have to deal with. No. Library of Congress, money was just swept up from a lot of these purposes. NSF money was just swept up, to pay for other crises.
I mean, to the extent that the states fund state universities, which have university presses, often those presses created with some mandate to serve the state through their publications. I mean, that's another dimension, too, that of government involvement, which is different from models in other countries.
Actually, a similar question comes up in regard to archiving digital information, because especially in Europe, many countries do have national policies and institutions, whereas in the United States, it's very distributed, which causes some concerns, but Don made some good comments about this, the benefits of distributed model too.
I was wondering if you would all comment a little bit more on the promises available to us via new modes of communication, whether it would be the net, multimedia, news, systems of visualization. Joe had mentioned the contributions made to systems of visualization in new editions, but I think also one of the things that I'd like to hear a little bit more about are the options available, especially to younger scholars, in bringing their new modes of communication into the scholarly field, whether it would be through some of the projects that Kate had mentioned yesterday in relationship to multimedia publishing, the possibility of new global forms of communication via video and alternative archival procedures of video and multimedia formats, and other alternative forms of scholarly communication, whether it would be listservs, multimedia journals, etc.
I think one thing we experimented is that, in fact, this new technology allowed us to conceive of the multilinguality differently. And then that's one of the reasons we decided not to publish, for instance, the entire volume containing different languages. It would be extremely expensive, too expensive, and then it's too bulky. But in fact, it is not necessary today. Therefore, if you, that's what we are trying to do is, if you want to create the certain kind of multilingual volume, then readers can simply pick up whatever they want according to the available sort of programs. So what I'd like to see, and some of us are working on it, is that gradually it expands to not only the multiplicity in language, but at the same time multiplicity in medium itself. And I simply don't have any technical expertise, so I cannot go beyond this point.
Let me respond to this question as far as my own project is concerned, and the answer is no, we have not gone into that direction. And when I ask myself why not, then it has to do with the American profession and the expectations of American universities vis-à-vis scholars, especially young scholars. The project in which I'm involved addresses a professional crisis. That is to say, it assumes that scholars are expected to produce scholarly work which can be evaluated in specific, given traditional terms in order for career patterns. As long as these patterns are in place, it would not be our primary task to go beyond that. However, I realize that, of course, these expectations are by no means stable. They will change. And as soon as they will change, I think a project like Signale will change with it. If I had conceived of this project in terms of a broader audience rather than an academic audience or a professional audience, then I would have done very different things. And I think there is something about the American profession, and this has come up before, which is very different from Europe. I think the humanities are much more professionalized in this country than in Europe, in the sense that you have very clear academic expectations, very clear career patterns, which extend into what you publish and what is accepted by publishing, including peer reviews, etc., etc. And this is a structure that has its very conservative moment, and that's exactly what you're talking about, that moment that has to be pushed in order to make changes.
Right, and I would just add that I think that my point about university publishing, thinking about university publishing is an important one, because university presses too often think simply within one business model that just doesn't work anymore, and that's why the crisis really is a crisis, in that the old business model isn't working. But if we think of ourselves as being part of a larger university effort to disseminate scholarly information, that frees us up to then be part of a larger and more, I think, exciting process. And I think that what we have to learn as university presses is the skills we have apply very well in new forms of media, and they don't just simply apply within a very traditional form of book publishing. But we've too often been, I don't know if afraid is the right word, but just we've so often thought within one mode that only results in a book, that we have to get outside of that, and I think we have to build that within our parent institutions.
Let me. Well, I was going to comment a little bit on your direct question about the multimedia issue, and this is I think, a big and increasingly urgent concern, especially as we get a growing body of students who really are able to work with a body of media that are not really traditional in the academy. The problems, though, of that are not straightforward, and as you know, and you can encourage students to use certain kinds of tools, but as you try to bring that into the scholarly community, there are more complicated issues. The issue of citation, for example, just to draw on one issue, and citing a clip in a film or a clip on a video of some sort, and the tools available to reliably do that kind of citation are not really well developed. The issues that Leah mentioned earlier about preservation and keeping those sources active is another issue, and the tools for incorporating them. These with other media. There are models, there are ways of doing this, but we haven't really spent, I think, enough time or seen enough examples to start building or devising strategies for incorporating that in sort of our standard communication methods. These are big problems. I mean, the art store, from our perspective, was one way of engaging at least some of those media questions, and we're now working with Society of Architectural Historians and to try to figure out how a journal could be produced that would be regularly able to incorporate multimedia models, images, and so on and so on. And you know, that is making some headway, but we've got a long way to go to start incorporating video. And it's not just a matter of investment in the solution, it's devising what the solution is so that it addresses the kind of needs and practices of scholarly activity. So it's a way of addressing your question.
I've got a question, and it came out of a phrase that you used, Joe, and I hope I wrote this down correctly. You talked about the distant past, and you referred to the decadence of abundance. I think that was the phrase you used, which made me turn around the other way. Clearly, at present, the humanities are underfunded. If the funding and money was not a problem, would all the problems go away? Or are there problems that would then become just more apparent?
This is a phrase I used quoting somebody else. Recently had his own take on university presses and was taking the sort of iconoclastic view that, you know, it's not really anything to do with university presses, but it's a larger systemic set of issues in the scholarly world. So I will take no I will take no credit for it.
There will surely be problems, and that will be exposed by that. And you know, to turn it around a little bit, Greg Crane has been asking for some time, what would we do with 1 million books? And you know, Google has made it available, but what as scholars would we do with them? And it's not evident what we would do. And so our ability to spend substantially more would take some time. I suspect we could do it, but it would take some time.
All the way back, please.
Yes, I'm very interested in this really old word from 1964, and that is paradigm, because I was there then. But what we've been hearing about again and again is the business model today, which looks at this from the point, from the desk of the university press. But as I sit here, I, as one who's teaching and doing as much research as I can, I'm thinking of it in a broader context, and I really have this observation, I guess a few questions about it. One is, I'd just like to know how you consider the motivation of scholars to participate. I was very much interested in Don's comments this morning about all the possibilities. They're all collaborative, for which the credit is hard to determine. And ego and ambition have been really important factors in motivating people to participate in the publication of their monographs. And those factors really aren't accommodated in some of these business models. So that's at the input end into the press. And then at the output end is something we're not talking about, and that is teaching. And teaching has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. We seldom ask people to go get information and give it to us as we used to. And that's where the citation issue is so important. Now we say, get information, repurpose it, revise it, and apply it in some creative way to a problem or something. And so publishers often have put things under wraps, so it's hard to repurpose them. But in general, that's the way teaching is done now, partly to address issues of plagiarism. You can't really plagiarize a creative assignment that relates to something that happened yesterday. And partly because we're involved in this student research model of teaching, and students are supposed to be assisting or working with professors on new issues. And it all is a matter of grabbing the information and reusing it. And we just have a different motivation for getting information. and just the consultation of material, the repetition, and the presentation of it is not enough. So I think the University Press has to think in a larger paradigm of how information is used now, what motivates people to participate in that process. So I'm sorry that's not a question. But it's sort of a question, does that matter, or is that just the point of view of someone who's teaching? Is that kind of relevant?
I'd like to respond on the business model point rather than the teaching point that you raised, because it connects with the issue of readers that was brought up earlier. And I think there's a real tension in producing scholarly work in any medium, because this goes to questions of sustainability too, that you have to produce, you have to have a business model that enables you to publish the product and support the people who make that happen. But that business model depends on sales, but the value is not of the work is not definable properly in the sales of the first 3 years or the readership of the first 3 years. If what you are publishing is a contribution to knowledge, contribution to scholarship, possibly one of the dots to be connected that we heard about earlier, this is something that may lie fallow on library shelves or in whatever repository for some time until all of a sudden it becomes incredibly useful to a scholar who is pursuing a certain line of inquiry, and there is a definitive piece of work on the particular piece of the puzzle that she is developing. And that's the real value. How do you have a business model for that when something is really harnessed properly and perhaps individually for a scholar some years after its publication? And I don't have an answer to that, but it's a deep philosophical question about this issue of producing scholarship in a durable form that is then available for future scholars to consult.
I have a question, two things. One response about the state. The model outside of the United States, I want to speak about Europe, which I don't know very well, but if you look at the Middle East, you look at India, I was just in India. The state owns a lot of the resources, what few resources there are. The state is the body that is authorized to decide. I was just telling Joe about this earlier. I go to a library, I want to consult a manuscript, well, it's owned by the state. And there are rules that govern whether I can even consult the manuscript, and the state decides. So the notion of who owns that information, and so I want to tie that in, and that's different from here in some respects, but tie that to the question of, or the relevance of ownership, or notions of what's proprietary. So we have a model, we have a scholarship model here, where the scholar owns the information at some level, the institution where the scholar is working owns it at some level. So everyone has a stake, it's not so much ownership, everyone has a stake. And because we then evaluate and credit based on that, various institutions, say the press, the department, the university, the field, the professional societies, all have a stake in controlling how much of that knowledge is going to be released, as it were, to the rest of the world. So, I just had a book reproduced from one of my classes, which cost $2.95 when it came out, which cost $22 to reproduce. I could have made a PDF illegally and circulated to my students, and I had a pang of conscience, and I didn't. It's a rare pang. So I'm wondering whether one of the things a couple of things that have been adumbrated. I mean, at some level, the scholars are now saying, because there are scholars also here who are involved in projects, saying maybe I need to invest in this process, and I'm now going to intervene in a way that is not so much circumventing presses and the library and so on, but I'm going to say, you know what? I know how to get this information out. I can think of a model that might work. It's not my business, as it were, to work out whether there's a business model, but I need to get information out. Right? Now, I faced this, in fact, I was just talking about this earlier. I faced this situation. This is something I needed to get out, so I got it out. And if I had to do it, then I did it. Now, should I be the one paying for it? Not necessarily. Or maybe I should be. Maybe I have a stake in it. And maybe posterity will care, and maybe 50 years from now, someone will pick up the book and say, evidently, University Press didn't do this. Evidently, the state was not interested, but this scholar was interested enough to do this. And if you look at my own field, Arabic literature, we have things published by Napoleon. We also have things published by scholars who took out a book, and there's a subscription, and 300 people subscribe to it, and their names are on the front. And the scholar went around to his or her friends, typically his, and said, will you please give me 50 francs or 50 Deutschmark or 50 whatever, because I need to get this out. And scholars got together and said, yes, this is a worthy enterprise. This needs to get out. And so I'm wondering whether it's not a little, I'm wondering whether we don't have a burden ourselves. I mean, I feel very much like I have a stake. I'm underpaid, but that doesn't change the fact that I think some things have to get out there. And maybe I need to get involved in putting it on my personal website, producing my own book, photocopying an article and distributing it when I go to societies. I mean, I can think of countless articles that are cited in the sources. TypeScript circulated by the author, and someone like Ayalon in Israel has written very important articles on the Mamluk military elites, which are only available in TypeScripts because he's never circulated them in any other way. So I'm just curious whether you think or you don't think that there is a way for scholars maybe to intervene, maybe use some of the apparatus and the structures that are available, but maybe circumvent some of the very costly hoops along the way, peer review, distributing the manuscript, getting it out there, because there is also a personal stake, right? I mean, I'm not going to produce something that I know everyone is going to ridicule and vilify. I mean, I have a certain stake myself in making sure that it's palatable, acceptable, honorable, and so on. So do the scholars have a larger role? Not just scholars, people could be outside the academy. Do the intellectuals, the scholars, the producers of knowledge have a role? Can they have a role that's outside the traditional? That was much too long. I'm very sorry.
I'm impressed that you made your comments without using the phrase open access. Go ahead, please. Any comments?
Well, it seems to me that this is a very important avenue for intellectuals and scholars. I mean, if you bring scholarship closer to the concept of the intellectual, then of course the traditional venues of university presses and academic publishing would be less important because they're also, in many cases, too slow for the immediate impact that you want to make in the public sphere. So you have to think about publishing in the public sphere or communication in the public sphere, and I think academic publishing is only a very small part of it and not necessarily the most important part of it. But then you would look at the press and all sorts of other things. And what is understood here, I think, is that academic publishing is a very specialized form of publishing, and especially in this country, a highly professionalized form of publishing. And I would agree with you that in other parts of the world, the difference between academic publishing and non-academic publishing is much more fluid. And it is definitely worth thinking about it. Why is it so clearly established here, and whether that has been particularly good for intellectual life in this country? Or maybe the fact that the academy has sort of been boxed in and has less and less impact on the public sphere in this country has something to do with this.
Go ahead, please.
Well, here's a business model. Imagine yourself getting on an airplane, and I mean, I've got my shabby clothes on, and so I'm not carrying bunches of books, which I'm always carrying. But somehow or another, I get upgraded to business class, and so there I am sitting by somebody who's looks really intelligent and really smart, and I don't want to seem like a ninny. So I decided I want to somehow be attracted to this person. So the person asked me what I do. Now I know a friend of mine who's a humanist. He says, whenever I'm in situations like that, I always tell him I teach Shakespeare. Nobody questions what I'm doing. I teach Shakespeare. That's fine. But what if you don't want to go that route and see what you do is actually really important. But you're there sitting with this person and you have to think really quickly. What do I do that is actually of public interest? I don't buy the distinction between And I don't think all Americans have to buy a notion that the academy is totally separate from the public world. And so you think about what it is, and this is where I think the technology might help us a bit, but it's really thinking that's going to cause me to understand, I teach the German Romantics. Nobody's interested in Kleist the way I want them to be interested in Kleist. However, they're interested in fairy tales. So I'm Maria Tatar, and I'm at Harvard, and I've managed, or I'm Jack Zipes, and I've managed to figure out how to sell what I do as a business model. But it's not betraying the academic, it's still keeping the academic quality there, but it's also reaching a larger product. And we're educators, so our goal is to figure out how to educate people, and it's not our job that they resist education, it's not their fault that they resist us. It's our job to try to reach them, and that's a business model. I mean, it was a great thing for French culture in some way that, what was it, Jean Seberg that helped sell Roland Barthes and Derrida and so on and so forth? I mean, it was a really great thing that French culture had all this great theory. But the French had a way of selling themselves to America, and the Americans bought it. There were a lot of historical events involved here, but there was a chance to educate a large public into a whole bunch of things that they probably didn't think they wanted to know about. Now, I'm trying to figure out how do I get books about Asia that will help people understand what Asia's about. I do a book about the Olympics or something like that. And I'm going to keep hunting for things by which I can find a way through, the Berlin Wall. But I think our goal is to try to figure out how to, I'll stop with saying that my father-in-law was a miner, and he had this idea, and he said, how hard is it to get copper? If you go out to downtown Ithaca, any slab of concrete has copper inside it. You just need to know how to extract it. Every single academic has something in him or her that is of public interest. It just has to be, but the scholar has to learn how to be involved in their own extraction process and bringing that stuff out to the public.
Well, I think you had a comment if you want to go ahead before.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, it occurs to me that a word I haven't heard either yesterday or today is a blog. And I just wonder, I asked out of curiosity, are there scholars who have blogs and engage with one another? Is that now becoming a form of scholarly communications? Do all these issues revolving around scholarly communications, or do they apply to blogs? Or is a scholarly blog something of an oxymoron?
Kathy wanted to respond to.
Well, I'll just say I was going to ask exactly the same question. What about the blog? But I think underlying the question, what about the blog, is also a question of audience and quantity. And for example, there's the blog Grand Textado, which is read by thousands of people and involves many lively scholarly discussions. And to my mind, it matters that this blog has thousands of readers participating in it. That's a way to disseminate ideas and create influence or momentum around certain ideas. And it has been the tradition in credentialing activities within the academy not to pay very much attention to audience share. So even if a book only has 200 readers, as Peter was mentioning, that book is considered on its merits, independent of its very small readership. And there may be other authors who sell thousands of copies where that's taken into account. But I do think the underlying question here of what is the importance of audience share for scholarly ideas and dissemination is a consideration that ought to be taken into account more than it is. And I think scholarly blogs such as Doug Kellner's or Grand Textado or others that I can think of are becoming extremely important opinion formers, and therefore have a very important role in scholarly communication that's neither in a journal, nor in a book, nor in an electronic book, but a very vibrant, ongoing discussion forum.
Let's take one more comment and turn it over to our panel, and then I think it's almost lunch. Please, go ahead.
I was provoked by Lindsay's reference to French theory to want to bring up another unmentioned topic, or rather one that's been explicitly mentioned in passing in some cases, but not really addressed directly, and that is the role of the translator in this new economy. For a project like Inoki's, translation is the essence of what's enabling the distribution of scholarship and ideas throughout vast areas of the world. But in the archival
I'm sorry,
projects,
would you raise your voice a little?
In the archival projects that Don was describing, for example, I kept thinking, well, are these being translated? Are they going to be accessible in more than one language? And if so, by whom? What quality controls are there? Who is choosing and training the translators? There are a lot of questions, I think, that I'd like to hear addressed on that topic.
I actually did see a couple of comments, but I think we all want to take a lunch break too, right? so let's. I would like to invite comments from our panel before.
Well, when you are dealing with foreign literature and scholarship that is written in that foreign language, then of course the question of translation, even for a university press, is absolutely crucial. Because what you will notice is that, let's say in the case of German scholarship on the Romantics, since that example was brought up, is vast, profound, and very important. But all those scholars in this country who are not working in the special field of German will have no access to it. And one of the tasks would actually be to make that scholarship available in translation. However, what you will find is that it is very difficult to sustain it financially, because the presses can usually not take care of the cost. We have just dealing with one example where we would like to have, and we have decided to have, the translation of an early work by Hans Blumenberg on metaphors, and we can do it only because the translator has agreed that he will translate without a fee if we can't get support. But that is a serious problem. I mean, otherwise you are absolutely right. I mean, scholarship is still very much limited by the fact that specialists, of course, have access to that, but non-specialists don't, which distorts the scholarly field.
Any other comments that we haven't had a chance to?
Oh, yeah. Well, in this case, of course, the significance of translator is probably, of course, it is related to the current state of humanities in American universities, but I think it's much more profound, as Peter mentioned, that, for instance, modern Japanese, modern Koreans, modern Chinese were all created by translators. There was no such thing as Chinese language or Japanese language in the early 19th century. It's only through the process of translating they created. Therefore, in this sense, the translation itself is a very, very specific form of translation, is that, I think, in a sense, historical foundation of the humanities today. And I think it is really changing. And therefore, that in a sense, we've been trying to come up with the re-examination of the concept of translation itself. So,
I might just say that, with the issue of blogs and even self-publishing coming up, I think that we sometimes forget the fact or overlook the fact that we are living because of the internet, we're living in a world where we have such a range of options in terms of what traditionally we thought of as a formal publication process. Now, just simply posting on the web and having blogs, it just sort of scrambles all of the ingredients in a way that we have to think about all the range of publication possibilities from the formal to the informal, and where the university press, where the university, the tenure and promotion process, how all of that plays in. But and you can look at it as lots of challenges, but you can also look at it as real opportunities there. And I think really it looks, when I think about the future, I think the possibilities much more outweigh the challenges.
Well, thank you very much. Jockey again.